Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Robin Corak, and I thank you so much for joining us here today. This is my third MoonCon, and I have thoroughly enjoyed everyone. So I hope you're enjoying it as well. And today we're going to talk about Persephone as Psychopomp, and a little bit about me before we start. I have two moon books out, actually. One, of course, is Persephone, and then the other one is Persephone's mother, Demeter. And I'm also a Reiki master, and I have my end-of-life doula certificate. So the talk of Psychopomp is very near and dear to my heart. So a little bit about how I connected with Persephone. When I was young, and actually I still do, I have a rare medical condition. But what that meant for me when I was younger was that as a younger child, I was very fragile, physically fragile. And so my parents and my family and my friends with the best of intent really enabled me. They did things for me. And it was a blessing and a curse, I guess you could say. I mean, on the one hand, you know, what kid doesn't want to have to not do chores or do anything for themselves? But on the other hand, it also, I think in a way, made me feel like I couldn't do things, like I didn't have any independence. And when I first read about Persephone as a child, reading through Greek mythology, I loved her story. And I resonated with her in a way that I hadn't resonated with other characters, or that's maybe deities. I didn't really know much about deities. And I think part of the reason I resonated with her was because she was full of contradictions, right? She's the goddess of spring, but she's also queen of the underworld. And I felt like I had a lot of different aspects to my personality, but also, and perhaps even more strongly, was the fact that she was a goddess and she was enabled. She was not given a chance to be independent. If you look at the story, her telling in the story. And for me, it was like both exciting and daunting. The exciting part was, oh my gosh, a goddess has some of the same challenges I do. And the daunting part was, well, if she's a goddess and she can't figure it out, what am I supposed to do? But she always stayed with me, and at different points in my life, she kind of faded away. But she came back again pretty strongly when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and really struggling to find my independence. And she came back into my life, and she's really never left. She's always kind of been there. Sometimes her voice is louder than at other times, but she's always been there. And when I wrote my first book, I originally had a different idea for a book, but she came to me and said, no, this is going to be your first book. And I'm so glad that was my first book, because it was definitely a labor of love. So before I get too much into Persephone's story, let's talk a little bit about what a psychopomp is. So psychopomp originates from the Greek word pompos, which is said to mean conductor or guide, and psyche, which is said to mean soul. So it's basically a guide of souls to or in the place of the dead. And it's basically somebody that, in most of the stories, escorts somebody to the afterlife or the spirit realm. But psychopomps can actually be very helpful once you're within the spirit realm as well. And I find that a lot of times liminal gods and goddesses, people that straddle kind of both dark and light, or both, you know, birth and death, they make very good psychopomps. And we've had a lot of psychopomps throughout mythology and history, and these include, Hermes, of course, who was the one who came and got Persephone back from the underworld. We have Chiron, who is the person in Greek mythology, the river Styx, the person that rows the boat across, that you pay a silver coin to get into the underworld. And in fact, in many funeral rites in ancient Greece, the people were buried with coins. You have the Valkyries from Norse tradition, who are the women who escort the brave warrior Vikings into Valhalla, which is the place they aspire to go once they die. You have Gwyn ap Nuth, and I apologize, my Welsh is not the greatest, but Gwyn was known, he's a Welsh god, and he is the king of Annwn, or the Welsh term for the underworld. And he would take his hounds and at certain points ride through the night looking for souls to take to the underworld. You've got Santa Marte, who is a deity that kind of straddles, I think, from what I've seen, paganism and Catholicism. But definitely she is the one you've probably seen that looks like a woman who is a skeleton. She, of course, works with the dead. You've got, in some of the voodoo traditions, you've got Mama Brigitte, you've got Baron Samedi, who work at the crossroads, right? And you've got Egyptian gods such as Anubis, the jackal-headed god who also was associated with death. So in just about every culture, every pantheon, you can find at least one deity that acts as a psychopomp, that acts as that guide or that liaison between the spirit realm and the mortal realm. And Persephone is, again, definitely one of those. So who is Persephone? She, as I said, is the goddess of the spring and the queen of the underworld. And that is a very broad realm to have oversight of, to be both associated with spring and birth and then the underworld and death. And there's a rationale to that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Most people are familiar with Persephone through the story of Homer. And Homer, basically the story goes like this. Demeter is Persephone's mother, and she loves Persephone, and she wants the best for her child. But she is not ready to let her child go. Her child's on the brink of womanhood. And if you read the stories, and Zeus is her father, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of contact between Persephone and Zeus in the story. But if you read the story, you'll find that other gods had asked for Persephone's hand in marriage. You had Hermes, you had Apollo, but Demeter, without ever consulting her daughter, believes they're not good enough, and so she turns them away. So Persephone is out one day, Demeter's gone, and Persephone is out with a group of other Greek, kind of like, I guess, not deities, but Greek mythological characters. And they're all out looking at flowers, and there's one particular flower that catches Persephone's attention. And she goes over to look at that flower. And as she does, she hears this eruption in the earth, and out comes this chariot emerging from the earth with drawn by black horses, and Hades is at its helm. And just this very kind of the impression you get, it's a very large, muscular man. And according to Homer's story, he kidnaps her, and he takes her to the underworld and forces her to be his queen. And Demeter is so depressed by this. First of all, she goes to find out what happened to her daughter. And the only person that will help her is the goddess Hecate, who later becomes a staunch companion for Persephone later in the story. But they go to try and find out what happened. And in Homer's story, it's very interesting because all of these different entities conspire to have Persephone kidnapped. It is Zeus, her own father, is in on it. Hades is his brother. And even her grandmother is in on it by planting the flower that draws her attention. So Demeter roams the countryside looking for any clue as to what happened to her daughter. And she finally comes across, I believe it was Helios, the Greek god of the sun. And he says, oh yeah, Hades took her. And he sees, I think, her getting distraught. And he says, oh, don't worry. She'll be a great wife to Hades. And as you can imagine, that does not put Demeter at ease. It just makes her more angry. And so what happens is she ends up being so depressed and so angry that she, as the goddess of the crop, the goddess of earth, refuses to let anything grow. And Zeus is wise enough to know that if this continues to happen, all of humanity will perish. And then who will be left to worship the gods? So he sends out all of these different people to try and appease her and offer her gifts or make her smile. And no matter how hard they try, it does not work. She is very steadfast in her resolution that she will not allow anything to grow on earth until she is reunited with her daughter again. Now, there is another part of the story that kind of branches off where she goes and works as a kind of a nurse for another family. But that part is not as relevant to what we're talking about today. But it is an interesting piece, so I encourage you to read the story if you ever get a chance. So ultimately, Persephone is in the underworld with Hades. And finally, Zeus realizes what Demeter is not going to change her mind. So he sends Hermes down to escort her back out of the underworld and reunite her with her mother. And Hades allows this, but whether he tricked her or whether it was an accident, she has eaten pomegranate seeds. And so technically she cannot leave the underworld because once you have eaten something of the underworld, you must stay. And ultimately what happens is that Zeus decides to come up with a compromise. He says that she'll have to stay in the underworld part of the year, but the other part of the year is when she will be reunited with Demeter, either on Earth or in Olympus or both. And that kind of wraps up the story. And it's very interesting. A lot of the themes having to do with Persephone and Demeter are also agricultural in nature. And so that is how, we get this kind of sense of like Persephone being here in the spring, when birth is afoot, when it's, the weather is good, when everything is lively. And then in the darker times of the year, that is when she is with Hades in the underworld. But that is just one version of the story. It's the story that we know probably the most. But if you look at other versions, such as the Orphic hymns, and you look at art and things like that from Greece, there is another story that seems to contradict and in some cases predate Homer's story. And in that story, while there is some trepidation when Persephone sees Hades emerging from the earth, she is not kidnapped or raped, as Homer claims. She actually goes and actually loves Hades. And it's more of a choice on her part to a certain extent. And there's a belief that when the story changed to Homer's version, that it was actually a change, that was a shift that was happening in the culture from more of a matriarchal culture to a patriarchal culture. And you see that a lot with various myths from different cultures. And so it's really being able to have that context in mind whenever you read any version of a myth. But if you go to Greece, and I was there a few years ago, particularly at Eleusis, which is where Hades, the entrance to Hades cave is, where the Eleusinian mysteries were held, you can see in art, in various art depictions, ruins that they found from ancient Greece, that actually there's many that show Persephone, Hades, and Demeter all together, and Demeter is smiling. She is not upset at all. And so there's this kind of image in the art from ancient Greece that there wasn't animosity between the two. There wasn't this, horrible crime done, that it was actually something that Persephone had some choice in. It's interesting because Persephone, if you think about it, she represents birth in her guise as the goddess of the spring. But of course, she's associated with death in her guise as queen of the underworld. And the cycles, right? Just like nature, just like the seasons cycle. And so there's this element of birth and death and rebirth. She encompasses all of those, which may seem kind of contradictory, but it's really not. Because if we look at nature, it's a constant cycle of birth and death and rebirth, whether it's the trees, whether it's the way the seasons occur every year. And so it actually makes a lot of sense that Persephone could have a hand in things that we see as two extreme ends of the spectrum. And actually what most people don't know is that her mother, Demeter, was also, both she and her mother were seen as chthonic deities, or deities attached to the dead. And in fact, the people that died were often called the Demetroi, which meant people of Demeter. And actually, if you read my book, Demeter, you'll find a lot of fascinating things about Demeter that we don't usually know about or see, all the various ways that she herself perhaps held some contradictions, and that she herself was associated with a range of different things. Everything from civic law to the Erinyes, the creatures of rage that were vengeful, to, of course, the being the goddess of agriculture and of the earth. The other thing I think that's important to note is the Eleusinian mysteries. And this also has a very psychopompic element to it. And the Eleusinian mysteries were held in Greece every year, twice a year. There were the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. And the lesser mysteries had to be done before you could be a part of the greater mysteries. But it is the greater mysteries that typically people talk about when they're talking about the Eleusinian mysteries. With these particular mysteries, it was open to all. The only people that couldn't participate were people that did not speak the language, speak Greek, they were sometimes referred to as barbarians, and people that had committed a heinous crime such as murder. But for the most part, everyone else was allowed to partake in these mysteries. And the other thing that was fascinating was that it didn't matter what your class was in the day-to-day world, whether you were somebody who was noble, whether you were a slave or peasant, once you participate in these mysteries, throughout that time that you were in the mysteries, there was no class or caste. Everyone was equal. And when you think about it, that's true of death, right? It doesn't matter what you were in this world. Everyone at some point dies. And in death, we are all equal. So a lot of interesting overlapping themes. But essentially what would happen in the greater mysteries, and we don't know for sure. We'll never know for sure because they were so secretive. In fact, there could be penalties such as exile if you were ever to share what occurred during the greater mysteries. So we have very few hard pieces of data, I guess you could say, but what archaeologists and others have been able to put together is that it was like many days that it took place. There would be a procession from what is now a cemetery in Athens to Eleusis, which is a city about 20 minutes outside of Athens, Piraeus area. And they would do this procession. There would be purification rites. There would be offerings. When it came time to do the main ritual, they were all ushered into Eleusis, into what they called an abaton, which is a kind of an area within a building. And they would come in there, and we don't know for sure what happened, but we know that there was some sort of reenactment of Persephone's story. Okay. And so the whole mystery seemed to feature or center around death and rebirth. And while people that attended these mysteries typically did not talk about what occurred, what many of them did say was that they felt a relief afterwards. They felt much less anxiety about death. They weren't as scared as they had been. They were ready to live their lives in a sense more fully without the threat of death hanging over them, because it was almost as if they had made peace in some way with death through this reenactment, through this ritual. And so definitely a lot of associations between Persephone and her mysteries and the mystery of death and rebirth in a sense. So Persephone, she acts as a guide for the dead, not in the same ways that Hermes does. Hermes basically takes people to the underworld. Persephone's work is more about guiding them, sometimes guiding them there, but guiding them once they're there within the underworld. And a lot of the stories, if you dig through the stories and you look at the art, it almost seems as though she was a nurturing force, a mothering force, comforting, helping spirits that I crossed into the other world. And actually Jennifer Rafe, who wrote a great book called Mysteries of Demeanors, she asserts that Persephone also helps these spirits to see their own divinity. So it's almost like some sort of solace in death, but she definitely interacts with those in the spirit world. And there are some sacred places for her. So for example, as I talked about Eleusis, in Eleusis, there is a cave known as the entrance, or believed to be the entrance to Hades. And outside of the cave you can see a pit where offerings were made. And the Greek often views caves not only as tombs, but also as wombs. If you think about it, it is very much like a tomb and a womb. It's a dark place, right? It's a kind of a contained place. And we know that, when we are planting our gardens, seeds grow in the darkness. So there is this activity, even if it's dark and still, things are still happening, even if we can't see them. And the Greek stored their grains, which were their riches, in silos under the earth. And Pluto, or Hades, was often known as Pluto. And both of those terms were used not only for the name of the god, but the realm that they oversaw. And they believed that there were great riches in the dark caves of Hades. And so again, we have this theme of life within death. If you look at some of the other sacred sites throughout Greece, one of the well-known sites is called the Necromanteum. And you had to cross the river Acheron to get there. And you can still visit there today. But what would happen, this was in the city of Epirus, people would go there. It was very much associated with Persephone and the underworld. And people would go there to speak to their deceased loved ones. So basically what we believe would happen is people would go to the Necromanteum. They would be purified, usually by water. Sometimes they would change into a simple garment. And they would make some sort of offering. And there would be priests and priestesses there to help with this. And when they were ready, they entered the necromantion. Now, the necromantion was this just this maze of underground tunnels. Okay, so and these tunnels would converge, and sometimes you'd be at a crossroads. Sometimes they would take you in circles, and they were very dark, but they were lit usually by torches on the side of the wall, just to provide just enough lighting to see one foot in front of the other, right? To be able to make your way forward. The tunnels were said to be intentionally confusing because they were trying to represent what it would be like to walk through the underworld. And so some people would actually sleep there with the hopes of getting a dream of their deceased loved one. But you would enter this labyrinth, you would walk through no directions. You would just make your way through the maze. And it could take hours. In some cases, people were there for days. And whether they because they slept there, because it took them long to make it through the maze, I'm not sure. But when they finally came out of the necromancy, of the maze, there would typically be a priest or priestess there. And that priest or priestess would invoke the spirits, but they would also invoke Persephone. And sometimes Hecate, who has an association with the dead as well. And once they had done enough, the seeker would finally enter a central hall, and they would provide an offering, which we believe was usually barley. So there could be, I mean, in many cases in ancient Greece, there are, offerings that were sacrifices of animals. But there's a lot of cases too where the offerings were agricultural in nature, barley or wheat or things like that. And the priest would then, or priestess would allow them to, or direct them to a dark chamber. And that was where they were to communicate with the deceased. Now, it seems like a lot of times these communications were direct communications, but there were times where the priest or priestess may have to get involved to help interpret what it is the deceased is trying to say. So what we're going to do is I'm going to lead you through a meditation to the necromantion. This is actually from my book, Persephone. So I'll give you just a minute to get into a comfortable space. What I will say is that we are going to go into the necromantion or something like it to visit ancestors or deceased loved ones. I would suggest that if this is work that is new to you, to pick an ancestor or loved one that you know well, that you feel very comfortable with, and that you feel comfortable has your best interests at heart. So take a moment to get comfortable. And in that comfortable position, when you are ready, close your eyes. Pay close attention to your breathing. Breathe in and out slowly for a few cycles until you're ready to begin. When you're ready, in your mind's eye, you see a door in front of you. This could be any type of door, a large wooden door, a glass door, even a portal. Once you see that door well in your mind's eye, when you are ready, step through the door. You find yourself on a hill at twilight. You can see below you what appears to be a cave. The air is a little chilly, and you pull your cloak more closely around you. You follow a path to your left down the hill and approach the entrance of the first tunnel. Persephone is waiting for you. She asks if you wish to visit the realm of your ancestors, and you state that you do. She explains that to do so, you must make your way into the cave and through the maze of tunnels, which will take you to the portion of the underworld that houses your deceased loved ones and ancestors. There will be some stops along the way, she says, but you will know what to do when the time comes. Persephone smiles, hands you a torch, and says that she will see you on the other side of the maze. You look at the dark tunnel before you. Its walls are lined with torches, yet the further you look down the tunnel's path, the more it seems like an endless black void. With some trepidation, you enter the tunnel and begin walking. The air smells dank, as if there is a water source somewhere. Your hands glide along the smooth, cold walls. The sound is a heavy stillness, similar to the sound you hear when you are underwater. The path curves and twists, sometimes leading to a crossroads where you must choose. Other times, winding in circles that seem to lead you back. Each time you are faced with a crossroads, you instinctively take the path to the left. Time seems to lose all meaning, and you feel yourself soothed in a trance by the simple act of making your way through the tunnels. The paths wind and turn for what seems like hours, until finally you arrive at a clearing. In front of you is an altar stone with offering bowls on either side. Persephone steps forward out of the darkness, but what appears to be the entrance to another tunnel or cave. You reach into your cloak and take out a handful of barley and a bottle containing a libation of some sort. You put each of these into the offering bowls beside the altar. Persephone asks you to place on the altar a representation of the ancestor or loved one that is deceased that you wish to contact. You do so. She nods and then asks your purpose in entering the spirit realm, and you recite the following words. I seek the wisdom of those who have gone before me, loved in life, remembered in death, whose blessings have brought me comfort, whose strength is fed by resilience, whose actions have blazed trails and paths that I may follow, and whose gifts I feel honored to share. Hear me as I come to you with humility and respect, seeking your knowledge, your wisdom. Feel me. Feel my love and gratitude for you. See me, one of your line, one of your heart. Show me. Tell me the answers that I seek. Please accept my offerings in your honor and in your name. Blessed be. When you are done, Persephone nods at you and leads you into the next entrance, and you follow her down a winding staircase. As you walk down the spiral, it is hazy, and although the light is somewhat dim, You are overcome by a sense of serenity. There are rivers flowing on either side of you, as Persephone leads you to an iron gate. Persephone opens the gate with ease, and you see in front of you a raised chair facing what appears to be an island of some sort. The island is surrounded by rivers on either side, and there is a stream connecting the two rivers, acting as a sort of moat in front of the island. Persephone instructs you to sit in the chair and explains that you will have the ability to speak with your ancestor or deceased loved one should they be willing to speak with you, but that there is an unseen barrier dividing the island from where you are, and that while Persephone, as queen of the underworld, may cross the stream, neither you nor any of the inhabitants of the underworld may do so. Persephone asks you which of your ancestors or deceased loved ones you seek. You name the ancestor in question. As Persephone approaches the stream, a bridge appears, and she is greeted on the other side by what appears to be an older woman, dressed in a long black cloak with keys at her waist. The woman's face is hidden by her hood. Persephone whispers in her ear, and the woman walks away from her with the intent of bringing the one you seek to you. You think carefully about what it is that you would ask of your ancestor or loved one, as you know your time here is limited, and your questions must be worded skillfully with intent for the greatest chance of clarity. Take a moment now to think about what you would like to ask, what you would like to say, and how you would like to word things. You sit on the raised seat, meditating upon your questions and your words, until the hooded woman returns with the ancestor or loved one you have requested to speak with. Persephone returns to your side, and the bridge across the stream disappears with each step she takes. You greet your ancestor or loved one by name. If this is an ancestor that you have not previously met in this lifetime, you introduce yourself and explain how you are connected. With great honor and respect, you speak with your ancestor or loved one, and you ask them for the information, if any, you have come to try to obtain. Sit quietly and listen. It may take a few moments for you to receive a response. The answer you receive, the words you receive, may come as though he or she is speaking to you, or it could be a vision or a knowing. The answer may not make sense at first, or you may receive general wisdom as opposed to a specific answer. You may ask clarifying questions, but be sure to do so sparingly. Try to take in any information that is being shared with you without judgment or expectation. It is not uncommon for information offered by the dead to not make sense at first, but often the meaning unveils itself over the course of the next several days or weeks. Take some time to simply absorb anything that is being shared by your ancestor or deceased loved one. When you feel the time is right, or when your ancestor indicates in some way that he or she is done, thank your ancestor and provide an offering. This could be a general offering of food or libations, or it can be something specific that you know your ancestor or loved one enjoyed during their lifetime. You thank your ancestor, loved one, again, for attending, for being there with you, for any information they may have shared. You then turn to Persephone, and she reaches out her hand to guide you back into your current time and space. You walk back up the winding pathway. Only this time, when you emerge from the entrance, you find that the maze-like tunnels are gone. It is now dawn, and you can see the hill that was your starting point a little ways away. You thank Persephone once more. And then you turn and you make your way back up the hill and through the door that brought you to this place. When you're ready, you walk back through the door. Take a few moments to return your attention to your breathing. When you're feeling grounded, open your eyes. Now, in a meditation like this, if you find that you need more grounding or do not feel like you've fully returned, you can immediately place your hands on the ground for a bit to get that grounding. You may also, you do this meditation in the future or after the session is done, want to eat a snack or drink something that can help as well. And I also encourage you, when you are done, when you've grounded, to be sure to take a moment to write in a journal or something. Just write your experiences. I have found that sometimes it seems like a unnecessary task or a chore, but when I have done this, things that didn't make sense to me in the meditation or that seemed irrelevant, when I go back later, a week later or so, and look again, sometimes longer than that, I find that things start to make sense. And it's a very interesting way. If you're doing any kind of psychopomp work with Persephone, I highly encourage you to document your experiences and to look over time what patterns you see, what information has been validated, those sorts of things. One thing I will say too about working with Persephone as a psychopomp is we tend to think of a psychopomp as literally working with the dead, and there is definitely that aspect. But Persephone can be worked with as a psychopomp to our subconscious as well. Because our subconscious and the underworld has a lot in common, right? We oftentimes, things that we cannot deal with, trauma, those sorts of things, may not pop up every day in our conscious mind, but they have a place. They are buried, so to speak, in the subconscious. So the subconscious is in some ways like the underworld of our experiences and emotions that for whatever reason we haven't fully processed perhaps in our conscious world. And so some of the same techniques that you might use in literally speaking with or working with the dead or those in transition can be used to work with our own subconscious, to talk with our own subconscious. And that there's more about that in my book as well, but I encourage you to try that. Like the meditation that we just did, simply tweak it to, I want to learn, for example, because oftentimes our subconscious holds past trauma, and we end up coping with things in a way that maybe was necessary for our survival when we were young, but that don't necessarily work in our relationships, for example, as an adult. As one example, I have a good friend who had a lot of childhood trauma, And what has happened for many years, he's finally started to really understand it, is that he sabotages his relationships. When things get scary or frustrating or even the slightest bit difficult, he does what I call the turtle. He pulls within his shell and just shuts everything out and pretends like things are fine. And obviously that doesn't always work so well when you're in a relationship or trying to maintain relationships. And so using this meditation that we just did as kind of a guide or a template, you could go and ask your subconscious instead of your ancestor, deceased loved one, to help you understand what is not serving you, what is holding you back, and why. So there are a lot of ways to work with Persephone and her underworld aspect. One, read her myths and read different versions of her myths to get a sense of who she really is. Offerings are great, and when you're working with Persephone as the queen of the underworld, one offering I find to be really good is to use dried flowers, because you have the flowers, the aspect of her, the goddess of spring, but the dried, of course, is that they are not living flowers anymore. You can set up an altar. I have an altar to Persephone and her underworld aspect, which includes a statue of her, dried flowers, the candle, a scrying mirror, bones of an animal that I work with. So you can include things like graveyard dust and hourglass skulls, whatever calls out to you in your relationship with Persephone. And also when I'm working with Persephone on a specific person I'm trying to reach, I may place a representative of a loved one that I'm trying to communicate with, whether it's something that they owned, like my grandmother's watch, or whether it's something that maybe they enjoyed or really liked, or a picture as well. And there are a lot of ways to serve her in this aspect in modern day, whether it's mediumship, being a death doula, tending to cemeteries, being a historian for the dead, priestessing or being a priest, grief counseling, ancestor veneration, even working as a mortician or in a funeral home, running or attending death cafes, or even volunteering in hospice. So there are a lot of ways to serve her in this aspect if you're interested in doing so. And I would just say Persephone is very multifaceted. Like I said, her psychopomp nature makes her a good ally for shadow work, but she's also good with manifestation, clarity, growth, and healing the motherhood in particular. And Demeter and Hecate are also good for these things. So if you are interested in Persephone, I strongly encourage you to look into Demeter and Hecate as well, because they all kind of influence and connect in a certain way. And so that is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for being here. If there are any questions, now would be a good time for those. And this will be streaming live, I believe, on Facebook. And you also can reach me at my website, which is in the comments at www.phoenixalmondrising.com. So I hope you guys have a great day. I hope you continue to watch MoonCon. There's still some amazing authors that are up next. And thank you again so much for being here. Have a great day.